Okay, The Darkness Out There by Penelope Lively. Quite an interesting story, this, in terms of structure and its influences. Starts very much like a fairy tale, with a young girl travelling through forest to a cottage to meet an old woman in a place that's quite remote, possibly haunted, and the whole idea of travelling to this place and experiencing childhood fears of evil, as in fairy tale evil, so fantasy evil, and then discovering that it's just a harmless old lady who then turns out to harbour a very dark secret and actually expresses an idea of real, somehow mundane, ordinary evil and destruction, which is revealed quite slowly. It takes its time for us to understand what's going on, just as indeed as that reflects the time taken by the two characters, Kerry and Sandra, to actually understand what it is that Mrs. Rutter is actually telling them, and somehow making the depiction of what has happened in the war that much more horrific. There are two central characters initially. There's Sandra and there's Kerry. They're in a club or at school run by a lady called Miss Hammond, the Good Neighbours Club. They go to help people in the community, and it's on a Saturday. Sandra and Kerry go to the house of an old lady. On the way to the house, which is in a place called Packer's End, it's a spinney, which is small wood, which local people tend to avoid because of the stories of hauntings, etc. Sandra is on her way there when she's frightened by Kerry, who appears and very much in a display of kind of rather immature, boyish insensitivity, frightens her on the way to Mrs. Rutter's, and the expectation probably is that she has begun as, if you like, the central character, the protagonist, and will continue to be so throughout the rest of the story, and that in some way Kerry will be shown the error of his ways, possibly, or shown to have misjudged Sandra in some way, which is quite interesting when you consider how things actually do turn out. Anyway, when they get to the house, they've done errands, they ask her about a local wood, which is meant to be haunted. Traditionally and conventionally, Sandra is mainly working in the house, while Kerry is doing things outside in the garden, etc., and doing the sort of heavier lifting work. But Mrs. Rutter invites them in to sit down and have tea and to feed them, and she starts to tell them the true story behind the popular myth about the haunting at Packer's End. She reveals that her husband has been killed in the war, and that she's lived with her sister Dot in the cottage, and that one evening in 1942, as a German plane has crashed, and they didn't have a telephone, and the weather was bad, and they went out to investigate before calling for help. And that when they got to the plane, they saw it was German, and they're pleased about that, obviously they've downed an enemy, and two of the men inside were dead, but there was one still was talking. Dot said he would not last long, and then they decide to leave him there, and I think that's when we first, as readers, have this quite horrific twist that they've actually left a young man dying in an aircraft. Regardless of his country of origin, he's still simply a young man who is trapped and calling for his mother. Although even that is dismissed by Mrs. Rutter as mudder, what does that mean? As if she doesn't understand how he will be calling for his mother, even doesn't have any understanding or comprehension of the basic situation and the awful pain that he's suffered. Sandra tries at that point to pull away a little bit, but Kerry, who has already expressed quite an interest and knowledge about the war, insists on hearing the rest of the story, not because he seems to be getting any kind of pleasure from it, but because he's sitting there in quiet horror trying to comprehend what she's actually telling him. The horrific element continues, and they learn that Mrs. Rutter and her sister actually return the next night, knowing that they'd left him dying there in agony and trapped, calling for his mother, and it turns out that he wasn't dead then either, and they've actually left it for 2 evenings, so he's suffered a very slow, lingering death. Mrs. Rutter shows absolutely no regret or shame for what she's done. In fact, she mentions having souvenirs from the aircraft, like many of the other people, and she explains it, that she sees it as revenge, her death of her husband, who's been killed in Belgium at the start of the war, and she's never married since then. She's a very, very bitter, cynical, quite perverse old woman, and shows no remorse whatsoever or understanding of just how horrific it is that she's saying this to these two young people. And in that sense, the stereotypes we've had set up to this part of the story, with the helpful young girl, the rather frivolous young boy, and the harmless, pleasant old lady who lives in the cottage, really are starting to become inverted, being turned on their heads, and we do see that the moral centre more and more becomes Kerry and in his reactions and outrage, and that Mrs. Rutter is depicted as quite a horrible old woman who has committed a dreadful crime when she's younger, and still continues to be that person. She hasn't grown beyond that. I say Sandra is shocked, but Kerry takes initiative, and quite early in the conversation, he stops Sandra, interrupts Sandra when she's trying to stop Mrs. Rutter revealing more of what has happened, and then he's the one who insists that they must leave, and does express his horror and moral outrage about what she has just said and how much sympathy he feels for the dead German. I suppose the other thing about that is, his language reveals quite a lot about the passion that he feels for this and the disturbance, because I noticed Mrs. Rutter actually rather coldly refers to the dying German as a tough bastard because he's lasted so long. And then once Kerry has left the house, he hasn't been disrespectful previously, he's not shown any kind of cursing. He actually does say he won't be going back to see that old bitch. I'm not going near that old bitch again. As he leaves, he says Christ, and then when he's thinking of the German, he's clearly upset by this, and completely empathic with the German who's suffered this horrible death, lingering death, 2 bloody nights. Christ, it's interesting that he is using the word Christ as well. The idea of the lack of compassion or any kind of religious spirit in Mrs. Rutter's actions, and obviously the moral outrage that he feels, and that he essentially becomes the key protagonist here rather than Sandra, and that Sandra as an observer realises just how much he's grown up, and that he is more mature than she thought. She has misjudged him, as indeed the reader may have done, and that he does have the moral high ground here. And of course at the end of the story they leave into a world that has grown unreliable, in which flowers sparkle and birds sing, but everything is not as it appears. Oh no, so the original title of the story, the original beginning of the story, the darkness out there suggesting this rather horrific journey into a sort of a fairy tale nightmare, has actually come true, but just not in the way we would have expected. The idea of real monsters lurk behind ordinary people who actually live quite dull, mundane lives. It's a third person's perspective on the story. It's told in third person, but it's from Sandra's perspective too. And we kind of tend to compare Sandra's viewpoint with how people are presented through their dialogue. It's how she responds to them. Obviously darkness and light are very symbolic here, and the idea of morality as well, and losing your childhood innocence by becoming aware of the darkness. There is something at the end of this that has tainted both Kerry and Sandra. Not that they've done anything wrong or made moral choices and have to face the consequences of that, as the children have to do in When the Wasp Drowned, but simply by having this awareness of, look, there really is this horrible evil in the world, and it isn't a storybook evil, it's a sick, perverse evil that comes from the twisted logic of people who believe that they have some kind of justification for their actions based on their own anger and bitterness. Okay, so Sandra really does witness Kerry growing up. You may see at the beginning that she's more mature because she's keen to help out the elderly and part of the Good Neighbours Club, but clearly he is the one who is then seen at the end of the story. Kerry is seen as the one who actually has the understanding and the moral outrage about what has just happened. There's obviously layers of appearance and reality being dealt with in the story. Mrs. Rutter appears to be a stereotypical nice old lady, but then the story reveals this awful side to her. And similarly with the children as well, the roles are reversed, where they become more like the adults who want to do the right thing and disgusted with the way in which Mrs. Rutter has behaved instead. There's also some idea here of the past. You don't escape the past, and it seems Mrs. Rutter's trapped in the past, in the loss of her husband and what she has done this awful night, or these awful 2 evenings, and the fact that she's not remarried and she hasn't gone on to be a particularly happy or pleasant person, obviously. And moral responsibility is really a core idea here, isn't it? The Good Neighbours Club is all about helping people and helping our neighbours, but the fact, of course, that these 2 young people are there to help the neighbours, but Mrs. Rutter hasn't helped the German. She's labelled him as the enemy, and therefore decided it was okay to leave him to die screaming for his mother. Okay, the story's set in the present day, but of course all the important events are in the past, during the Second World War. There's a contrast between the life of young people at this time and then, that Sandra and Kerry lead quite innocent, carefree lives looking forward to a settled future. Kerry, just quite ordinary, wants to leave school and become a mechanic. He's not particularly popular. Sandra doesn't really want to work with him, but he's quite practical. He works hard for Mrs. Rutter, and then he obviously has quite a sane reaction to what he's just been told. I think anybody else would have the reaction in the same position. And Sandra, again, very average teenage girl, comes from a secure background, likes sewing, looks forward to falling in love, thinks she's going to be a secretary when she leaves school. And she just joined the Good Neighbours Club to help people and have fun with her friends. So the story's mainly told through her eyes from that perspective. And she's quite innocent at the beginning of the story and quick to judge people, particularly Kerry, obviously, but ironically by the end, she's obviously reconsidered her judgments there and understands a little bit more about Kerry's value, and that Mrs. Rutter, who seemed to be the typical old lady, housebound, in need of help, very friendly and chatty, obviously has in fact made this awful decision not to get help for this man who was trapped, and although it seems perfectly natural right to her, obviously Kerry and Sandra then see her in very much a different light. I think also for me personally, it's the way she reveals this to them, this idea that she has these children round, and the sort of the typical cliched English polite scenario of making tea and entertaining and welcoming guests, and in the middle of this, slowly the details are revealed that make it clear as to what she's actually done, and she seems to have no concept of how this would be totally inappropriate to reveal to young people and the effect it may have on them. Packer's End itself is a very dark and mysterious place, but it's also symbolic. It's the darkness out there are possibly the things that we don't know about, things that we learn as we go through life which disturb us and possibly we would rather not know. And certainly that is the case for Sandra and Kerry as they go through the stories. Very much set out, as I say, like a fairy tale, the journey through the woods, the haunted woods, the old lady, the mysterious dark place. And Sandra remembers thinking that it was full of witches and wolves, and there are elements of that that are like a fairy tale, of course, but of course in the end there is rather a horrible presence in that house, but in the guise of an old lady who seems to be quite helpless and makes tea and chats amiably about the horrible things she did during the war. The story is written in the third person but seen mainly through Sandra's eyes, I've said, so we know what she knows and we see what she sees, so there's no sort of dramatic irony, which I think is really important here, that we find out these events as she and Kerry discover them, so we share the horror of discovery with them as we slowly realise what it is that Mrs. Rutter is saying to them. Mrs. Rutter, of course, tells her story within the main story itself. She doesn't do it as a continuous narrative, but keeps getting interrupted by questions and comments from the teenagers. I think it adds to the horror as what she has done is actually slowly revealed, and we realise what it is that's actually been said. There's a lot of dialogue and colloquial language, sort of tends to add to the ordinariness of the setting. At times it's almost like a play script, and that contrasts nicely with the horror of what's actually been said. The idea of this horrific thing being revealed in a very pleasant, rural, idyllic setting. Again, similar, I suppose, to in some ways to the use of the garden in When the Wasp Drowned. The language of the whole narrative is quite colloquial and down to earth, so it is almost very much as if we were sharing Sandra's thoughts. And of course it is sort of her perceptions, her stereotyping, if you like, of Kerry and indeed of Mrs. Rutter that is challenged as the story progresses, and the reality is in stark contrast to the first impressions that have actually been made. So the main thing of this story is the contrast between how things appear, how they may appear, and how they actually are, and what is lying beneath the everyday, ordinary, mundane appearance. And even the most horrendous crime isn't always brought to, people who commit these things, not always brought to justice. It's not always known and dealt with, and that it can lie there festering and can be discovered many, many years later by two innocent children who feel that they're simply good neighbours out to visit an old lady and do a good turn.